If you're looking to create, grow, and sustain your wealth, download and subscribe to the Pain Points of Wealth podcast at BeBullish.com with Bob, Ryan, and Chris Payne. It's your podcast for market insights, money tips, and real talk on the economy. Download and subscribe at BeBullish.com.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
Let the Record Show with Judge Richard Weinberg, Suffolk County Republican Committee Chairman Jesse Garcia, and essayist and commentator Eric Lavine on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the Vice Chair of the State Republican Party and the County Chair of the Suffolk County Republican Party. With us is Eric Lavine, noted commentator, attorney, and essayist, our co-host. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg, and today we have two very important and interesting guests joining us. First, we have Peter Ruff, a expert on foreign policy, particularly on Europe and Russia, the whole Ukraine situation. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, a former advisor to President Bush, and we've had him on before. Peter, you always have wonderful, insightful things for us. So I turn you over to Eric. The topic, obviously, is what's going on with the Ukraine, what's going on with Russia. As we walked into the studio today, there was an announcement by President Trump that in a couple of weeks he expects to have a meeting with Putin. He's sending out a delegation headed by Secretary of State Rubio and others to meet with high-level Russian people. He was very optimistic with the call, started talking to him about trade deals when the war with Ukraine is over. My problem, and I turn this over to Eric and to you and to Jesse, my problem with this, I've heard these optimistic riffs from President Trump before. I don't trust Putin. I don't trust his mental stability. I don't trust his moral or lack of moral compass. I think he promises the world on a phone call, and then the next thing you know, he's killing innocent civilians. Eric.
So, Peter, welcome back.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Our pleasure. So anybody who knows me will tell you that I generally judge the wisdom of an individual by the degree to which they agree with me. So suffice it to say, Peter is a very, very, very wise man. So let's start from that premise. So, Peter, what is the status of the war in Ukraine? I mean, we've all been focused on Gaza for now. People have been distracted from what's going on in Ukraine. Where are we?
Well, I would say on the military front, there have not been dramatic changes. There still is a grinding, I'd almost say attritional war taking place in the so-called Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainians have built what is commonly referred to as a fortress belt of defensive lines, which the Russians continue to pound away at. The Russians have made incremental gains. They continue to do that, and they have achieved no great strategic breakout. So they're still pushing away, plugging away, taking enormous losses. And I would say if you and I were speaking a few months ago on the show, we probably have a similar assessment. So the action has been less on the military front and more so on the political level, where there have been changes, and as was just noted, pretty dramatic ones, for example, with the president's call today with his Russian counterpart.
So absent these political changes, what's Putin's strategy? Is it just to wait out Ukraine and Europe and just hope they give up? Because, as you point out, incremental change for this kind of expense to your economy, to the killing of your own people, how does he win in his mind?
Well, he has been promised breakouts and breakthroughs in his own system repeatedly, and the Russian military hasn't managed to meet any of those schedules. For example, take a town which has been in the news a lot, the city called Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine. The Russians were supposed to take it this time last year, and they still haven't taken it, even though they're trying to knock on the door and ultimately envelop and take the city. So I think these incremental gains surely frustrate Putin, but in his thinking, he is a much larger, stronger player than President Zelensky. He commands more resources, more manpower. And so slowly but surely, he's chipping away at the problem. And eventually, he, I think, hopes to achieve a breakout. So if he can manage to get through that fortress belt into the central plains of Ukraine, maybe there's a breakthrough moment that he sees somewhere on the horizon. Secondly, I think he sees political disunity and division at times in the West, or the opportunity to pull the West away from President Zelensky. And Ukraine has to borrow American and European power to stay in the fight because, as I mentioned earlier, they simply are the smaller player in this one-on-one battle with Russia. So that basically means that Putin is plugging away, surely frustrated, but thinks that he can either push Europe and the U.S. away from the support for Ukraine or eventually achieve some sort of breakthrough that leads to a broader breakout and potentially a run on some of Ukraine's larger cities. But he hasn't achieved it yet, and if he assesses that the pain is too large, that eventually he has to cry uncle, then maybe he is prepared to go into negotiation. We just have not reached that point yet.
So do you think that the overflight of NATO countries with drones and other military hardware, I can't for a moment believe it's by accident, so the alternative to that, of course, it's intentional. Is that designed to dishearten NATO in his mind, or to broaden the war, or what? What explains his intentionally flying drones over Romania and Poland?
It's a good question. There's a lot of debate in our own intelligence community about those incidents, but the number of them in a pretty compressed time frame suggests that there is intention to it. I think there were probably 2 or 3 reasons for why the Russians, in the most dramatic incident, which is the overflight of Polish territory, including drones, even though if they were merely decoys deep into Polish airspace. I think the explanation for those is probably that, one, the Russians are holding their major military exercises. These are not even annual exercises. They take place every 4 or 5 years. The Zapad exercises, they're meant to simulate and test a war with the West. And so in anticipation of that exercise, which kicked off a couple of days after that incident, they wanted to, I think, test potentially American radars in Europe, Western response moves, and by and large get some military utility out of it. Secondly, it was at a time of heightened discussion about sanctions against Russia, and there was a European team in Washington to meet with their counterparts at the Treasury Department and elsewhere to talk about next steps potentially against the Russians on sanctions, as President Trump's frustration was at a boil. And so that, too, I think, was something of a brushback pitch to hurt and hit the Europeans. And then third, it distracts a little bit from some of the failings in the Donbass, some of the weaknesses in the Russian campaign, because Putin's narrative at home is that he's fighting a war not just against Ukraine, or else how could he not win, but against the entire West. And that justifies the huge losses which the Russians are taking. So in that sense, some sort of hybrid campaign, gray zone operation against NATO partners fits into the propaganda that's being fed to the Russian population at home. So I think all those factors combined, it's very interesting if you look at who is targeted, who has been targeted in these. These are crucial states on the Eastern Front, like the Romanians and Poles, who have been very important supporters of Ukraine. And it also includes, like, for example, the Danes, a country that has really been at the lead in purchasing weaponry for Ukraine and sending their own stockpiles to Kyiv and buffing up European political support for the Ukrainians. And in that sense, it was a shot across the bow. But he'd also like to exacerbate some political divisions in Europe. Others who are skeptical of support for Ukraine in the European political scene will say, look what you were doing. You were simply leading us down the dangerous path to war. So it's an intimidation as well, meant to divide European politics, to ultimately get Europe away from supporting Ukraine, at which point he can basically turn it into a fait accompli.
So obviously Putin is watching very carefully what's going on in other parts of the world, in particular, I guess, Gaza. Is there any lesson for him to learn? Do you think this in part explains why he's willing to meet with Rubio down the road? Is there any lesson for him that he may have learned about American willingness to use its military power and flex its military muscle in the Middle East that may have changed his calculus?
Well, I think the first dynamic or implication of the Gaza settlement for Ukraine is the factor of time. The U.S. president can only turn his attention to so many issues at one time. And now that he being President Trump, has a framework in place in the Middle East, he can train his sights more squarely on the war in Ukraine. So after a trip to Egypt and Israel the last couple of days, there's now a beehive of activity around Ukraine. President Zelensky will be in Washington tomorrow. His senior aides are already here preparing the groundwork for that Oval Office meeting. And as we just discussed in the long phone call, apparently it was over 2 hours between Presidents Trump and Putin, the Rubio preparatory visit or meetings with his Russian counterparts, followed by a presidential level meeting in Budapest, is being prepared. So the time factor matters. As to other parallels, there are questions of strategies. To get the agreement in the Middle East, President Trump utilized what I would describe as classic coercive diplomacy. Israel hit Hamas hard. It demonstrated through its Gaza City operation that the hostages weren't going to save Hamas from destruction. And in turn, Hamas calculated that it would be better off striking the deal that President Trump put before them, including with the presidential warning to accept the offer or else. But, in the Middle East, Hamas was weaker than our ally in Israel. The challenge in Europe is that Russia is a major nuclear power astride the Eurasian landmass. It is larger and more powerful than our partner, Ukraine. And Russia's major supporters in Iran and China and North Korea, not as easily swayed by U.S. diktat, U.S. discussions, U.S. diplomacy, whereas the major supporters of Hamas, Qatar and Turkey, for example, but then also others in the Arab world who are at least neutral, bending towards Hamas, or just neutral and want this to end, are very positively inclined towards listening to the president and taking advice from the U.S. And when they signaled to Hamas that the game was up, I think the Hamas had little choice but to strike the deal. So in that sense, there are differences between the Middle East situation and the European one. But power matters most. Coercion is important. And in that sense, the Europe is no different than the Middle East.
This shrimp and coconut sauce is divine. What's your secret?
Goya coconut milk.
How does it taste so good?
It's all in that real coconut flavor and that rich, creamy texture.
What about thickeners and added sugars?
None. Just smooth, coconutty goodness.
What can I make with it?
From curries to sweet treats like coconut flan, the possibilities are endless.
Goya coconut milk. Take your cooking to the next level. No question about it. Find it in the Goya section of your local grocery store. If it's Goya, it has to be good.
We all love a legendary comeback, and Degree Original Cool Rush is back and better than ever. Cool Rush isn't just a scent, it's a movement, a fan favorite that delivers bold, fresh vibes and all-day sweat protection. Whether you have a man that spends hours in the gym, heads into the office early, or is just trying to stay fresh on a long day, Cool Rush has their back. Head to your local Walmart or Target and grab Degree Cool Rush, the fan favorite scent from the world's #1 antiperspirant brand.
Anyone can follow. It takes something special to be an original, which is why the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV arrives with new ways of surrounding you in luxury, including the ultra-wide 48-inch panoramic display and the multi-sensory Lincoln Rejuvenate experience. A true original never stops evolving. So meet the 2025 Navigator, the original that's all new and better than ever. Learn more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Navigator are trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
This episode is brought to you by Marqeta. When it comes to your payments provider, you can't afford to compromise. Marqeta's modern payment solutions flex with your business without the trade-offs. Stable and agile, secure and innovative, scalable and configurable. If they say you can't have it all, don't believe them. Your business demands more. Choose a payments provider that delivers more. Choose Marqeta. Visit marqeta.com/Spotify to learn more.
Jesse, questions for Peter.
Peter, thank you for your insight here. I was wondering, actually two questions. First, President Trump's suggestion to NATO allies that they should shut down any of the drone incursions that are in their airspace. That on top of the talk of Tomahawks being shipped and provided to Ukraine, which could certainly everyone has been saying it would be a game changer. How do you believe internally that is being received by Putin and his military establishment?
I think those are probably two different case studies. When it comes to the shoot down of drones, I mean, there is a clear distinction between NATO and Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. But it isn't lost on anyone that Ukraine has been fighting alone in terms of its men dying in Ukraine for the better part, or actually more than 3 years now. And so I think any ally will be very judicious and circumspect and careful in engaging Russia, especially if it's a manned system. I mean, there have been violations of Estonian airspace by Russian fighters, unless it believes that it has the backup of the U.S. So they think about the escalatory ladder prior to taking such a decision to begin with. An unmanned Russian drone, especially a decoy drone, I think poses kind of a different case for NATO leaders. But the president's saying he's willing or thinks, go ahead, shoot it down. It reminds me a little bit of 2015 when the Turks shot down an actual manned Russian fighter jet. That was a major incident because, of course, that it's different shooting at an unmanned versus manned fighter jet. But I think it's very vintage for President Trump, and that he opens the aperture, and the range of policy options are pretty broad. And so he's willing to just say something like that at the UN General Assembly when pressed by a reporter in ways that I think you had much more narrowed policy discussions with somebody like President Biden. As for the Tomahawks, I think that really, unlike kind of the defensive move of shooting down a weapon or a system that's over NATO territory, providing Ukraine the Tomahawks that can fire deep into Russia really, I think, puts up the antennas of the Russians and gets their attention. The British have provided Kyiv with the Storm Shadow, which is an air-launched cruise missile. The French have provided the so-called Scalp, which is their variant. We've provided so-called ATACMS missiles, but the range of these is in the hundreds of miles. The Tomahawk is in the high hundreds of miles, and it begins to put, fuel depots, air bases, tank factories. The famous Russian drone plant in Tatarstan, which is hundreds of miles east of Moscow, in range. This is where the Iranians build the Russians build their Iranian-designed Shahed drones. So that, I think, is surely something that Putin wants to prevent, and I'm fairly confident that it's something he would have brought up on the call today with the president.
So, Peter,
one more follow-up, if I might. It's been about 2 weeks since President Trump spoke at the General Assembly of the United Nations, and there he said to the European nations that they should not purchase fossil fuels from Russia, which is fueling or is funding their war against Ukraine. In the interim period, have you seen any changes in Europe's consumption of fuels from Russia, or any discussions to do that? Has there been any change, basically, is my question, from that statement from the president to his European allies and action regarding the acquisition of fossil fuel from Russia?
There have been negotiations once President Trump raised this between Europe and the U.S., and the Europeans have moved up the final date by which they will end their purchases of Russian hydrocarbons. But I would just note, this while still significant, this is a relatively small amount compared to where in 2022 the Europeans were, and it pales in comparison to Chinese and Indian purchases of Russian energy. So there are still piped oil heading to Hungary and Slovakia, which are relatively small economies. They asked for an exemption from the EU decision to end purchases of Russian oil, and the European Commission has urged President Trump to make clear to Bratislava and Budapest, where there are two leaders who are positively inclined towards him, that this should end and that they should look for an alternative. There is LNG still going to a few select countries, the Netherlands, France. Some of that travels onward into Germany. So I suppose you could say the Germans are somewhat implicated in this. But Europe has really wound down, and I understand there might even be additional talks underway about speeding up that wind down their purchases of Russian energy in recent years. And the president's statement at UNGA wasn't just Europe; he said NATO, which would include Turkey. And the Turks are significant purchasers of Russian hydrocarbons. So that's another threshold or barrier that we'd have to cross to eventually achieve that goal. If he hooked his own, or the president hooked his own sanctions decisions to Europe going all the way down to zero, then the Europeans would counter, well, the U.S. should end purchases of Russian fertilizers, for example, and other examples where we're still slightly on the hook. So my argument has been that we should try to move in lockstep and set the same standard across the board. And there are probably other areas where the U.S. could do more, and then where Europe could do more. But really, the main player, the main issue is still, I'd say, China and to a lesser extent, India.
Peter, we have to take a hard break. I want to thank you very much on behalf of Chairman Garcia, Eric Lavine, and myself for that insightful analysis of the Ukraine-Russian situation. As these meetings take place between Secretary Rubio and his group with high-level Russian personnel, as well as a follow-up meeting with the President, Putin, and Trump, would like to bring you back to get your analysis of those.
My pleasure.
As well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Peter. And once again, you are very wise.
Thanks for listening to Let the Record Show with Judge Weinberg, Chairman Jesse Garcia, and Eric Lavine. You can hear Let the Record Show Sunday mornings at 6. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode, so you never have to wonder,
what the heck is going on here?
If you're looking to create, grow, and sustain your wealth, download and subscribe to the Pain Points of Wealth podcast at BeBullish.com with Bob, Ryan, and Chris Payne. It's your podcast for market insights, money tips, and real talk on the economy.
Download and subscribe
at BeBullish.com.